technological leader, on track to be the largest economy in the world, massive manufacturing superpower that doesn't need help from anyone, a military, especially a navy, that could take on and defeat the United States, on the verge of having the global currency. All of this is utter horse. In the world before World War II, you had a series of competing empires who had good land and good internal transport and a technological edge, and they dominated the world, and they fought over everything. And those fights brought us World War II, and it all came crashing down. And then the Americans found themselves facing Stalin. We're like, oh, he's kind of scary. We're going to need some people to stand between us and him. And since everyone who was a potential candidate who had just gotten out of the world's most horrific war, they needed some incentive. So we paid them. We used our Navy, the only Navy of size, to survive the war, to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could trade with anyone else and access any commodity in any market at any time. In exchange, you had to side with us against the Soviets. And that created NATO and the Japanese and the Korean and the Taiwanese alliance. And ultimately, by the time we got to 1980, it involved China as well. That political and security deal is globalization. And the Americans have been backing away from that now since 1992. So the fact that the Americans saw it as a security deal, everyone else saw it as an economic deal. The Americans never invested their economy, everyone else did. You can see where I'm going here. Without that sort of security overwatch, none of the rest of it works. That's only piece one, though. Piece two is when everyone started trading, they started specializing. And when we were all living under an imperial system, most of us were farmers and kids were free labor, and you would have as many as you could plus one, because that's how you found out you had too many. But when the world started to urbanize and industrialize, we started taking manufacturing and services jobs, and none of those were on the farm, they were in town. And when you move into town, kids go from being free labor to a free source of migraines. So you have fewer. Fast forward 75 years, the world isn't running out of children. That happened 40 and 50 years ago. The world is now running out of working age adults. And countries that joined this system later, that started urbanizing later, could basically pick up the idiot's guide to making a city and do it a lot faster because the technology had advanced. There were more countries with experience. And one of the last ones to do that was China. So the Chinese urbanization experience really didn't get going until 1980, but it happened so fast that in a single generation, they've gone from an average of 5 to 7 kids to, in places like Shanghai and Beijing, 0.7. And so we're looking at complete population collapse across a lot of the world. But in China, it's going to be so dramatic, it's also going to trigger civilizational collapse. They no longer have the young people to consume or build. Their labor costs have gone up by a factor of 15 since the year 2000. And they now are on the verge of being the grayest country in the world without any replacement generations coming up from behind. So the idea that they can be the world's largest economy is just, it's silly, even if you believe Chinese statistics. And the last time the Chinese issued a bit of an oops, they disclosed that they overcounted their population by over 100 million people. So, you know,
kind of a lot.
Yeah, the scale of the disconnect here between reality, Chinese statistics, and popular belief is just shocking. Well, the have-not thing doesn't mean as much when you are in a dictatorship. So, I mean, social stability, political stability matters, but they're really in a one-man government system, and they have a cult of personality. So it's certainly there kind of grinding under the surface. It's not a plus. But if you had the degree of economic inequality of China in a place like Germany, I mean, things would break. I think it's more of an issue that Chinese agriculture was never particularly productive. It was very, very labor intensive. It was basically think the Jews in Egypt in 4000 BC or whatever the year was. You know, it's slave labor where people are living a subsistence existence under the tutelage or control of the state. You can only go one way out of that. Because there was so much labor, it was actually pretty productive per hectare. But now that everybody's moved into a city and everyone's been in a city for 20 years, they've forgotten how to farm like that. They can't go back. And the type of agriculture that the Chinese need to grow their food in the areas they need to grow it can't be mechanized very easily. So we're looking at a population collapse and a food collapse. At the same time, we're likely to see a manufacturing collapse and a political collapse. I mean, there's a long list of bullets that are in the magazine that is in the gun that's pointed at China's head right now. Well, remember, China is a one-man state now, so it's really hard to decide what the political system even means anymore. It's been a progressive thing. So when Deng Xiaoping took over after the death of Mao, he had a collegiate cooperative group, a really large political elite that ran the country, because he never wanted to see it return to the one-man state of Mao and the horrors of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution that killed, tens of millions of Chinese and set them back 50 years. He wanted to do something different. And so he set the stage for the China we know today, which is the industrial power. And he gave way to a pair of guys, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who represented different factions, and each of them ran the country for 10 years, and they were chosen by Deng while Deng was still alive. So Hu knew he was going to start in this year and finish in this year, and he knew that 15 years before he got the job. And that has worked reasonably well for them. But Deng realized he couldn't see forever. So he knew that by the time they got to the next guy, he wasn't going to be able to choose that person. So he assigned the Zhang faction and the Hu faction to come together and pick jointly someone new. And that is Xi Jinping, the current guy. So Xi Jinping, originally, it was thought that he was going to be in the middle of a tug of war between these two big factions. He spent the first 5 years of his presidency destroying those two factions. And he spent the next 5 years of his presidency destroying any other pole of independent power within the country, whether it was in business, local government, or the bureaucracy. And he basically took anyone in the country with intelligence and the capacity of forming an independent thought and exiled them, imprisoned them, intimidated them to silence, or just shot them. And there's now no one left. It's just Xi. And so no one wants to bring him information because you might get shot for that. Because you don't know the status of the conversation of the voices in his head. Right. And so we're seeing increasingly stupid decision making from the very top with no one willing to challenge him. This is how you get that spy balloon, which is the dumbest thing I've seen a government do in 20 years. And if you think of the last 20 years, there's been a lot of dumb.
That's right.
This is how you get people disinfecting airport runways because they think that's what the leader wants. And we're seeing this in finance and in agriculture and manufacturing and in subsidies and across the governance space. Now, when you decide, you're threatening Taiwan, saying we're going to integrate it forcibly if necessary, this does get popular support. People like the idea of one China because, the Chinese are right. Throughout their history, when it hasn't all been in one piece, it's been a freaking disaster. There could be something to it, but I don't think so. So when you decide you're going to invade a country, you don't just wake up and pull the trigger. You build your military with that goal in mind. And that means for years, sometimes for decades, you have to make certain assumptions about how you think the war is going to unfold. And what the Russians have provided for the Chinese is proof that the Chinese chose wrong on everything. So assumption number one, it's going to be an easy fight. Not as easy as invading Ukraine, because you can walk to Kiev, you have to swim to Taipei. But still easy. Well, clearly it wasn't all that easy. Number two, Russian weapons are awesome. So let's steal all their IP just like we do for everything else and spend $3 trillion manufacturing clones of those weapons for our crews. Well, they're having some serious buyer's remorse, or I guess it would be thieves' remorse.
Just remorse.
Yeah, thieves' remorse. Third, Russia's too important. We are too important. So if there is a war, everyone will just suck it up and make do. Oops. But I think what has really terrified the Chinese government is the boycotts. Because the sanctions hurt, there's no way around that. But the boycotts hurt a lot more, at least a factor of 4 more. And you had companies that had sunk in excess of $20 billion into Russia that just walked away. And the Chinese don't even have a concept for the idea of corporate or citizen agency, much less an understanding of what they would do if they lost access to foreign corporations, technology, and markets. It's an entire development model. So every guess they've made, they've guessed wrong. And they would be suicidal for them to now act, because they also don't control the high seas, so they'd also lose all their manufacturers' exports. all their commodities, imports, and all their energy. So best case scenario, where they capture Taiwan without firing a shot, they still deindustrialize and have a famine in under a year. You know, this is not a winning scenario here. Even the winning scenarios are awful. So normally I would say...
Bad news, you won.
Yeah, exactly. Normally I would say they wouldn't even consider it, but
Right.
it's a one-man show.
Yeah.
And so it's entirely possible that Xi will pull the trigger, or some over-enthusiastic idiot bureaucrat will pull the trigger, not realizing the damage he's about to cause and cause the downfall of China as an industrial power. It's still possible. It's just not sane.